Hello everyone, I'm Adam Ferry. I'm an occupational therapist and one of the directors of the OT service. Thanks for joining today. As you can see from the title, we're going to be exploring proportionate handling and the environmental factors to meet that need. Now, the start of the presentation is going to focus on what we mean by proportionate handling to explore that in a little more depth. But then as we go through the webinar, we're going to consider what the impact on function is on single-handed care in particular, and how we can start to consider the environmental impacts of that and what we can do to the environment to support it, or what challenges we need to consider. So some learning objectives, we're going to discuss what proportionate handling is and the potential impacts. We're going to consider the functional implications of a single-handed care recommendation. And we're going to reflect on how environmental design can hinder or promote single-handed care. So let's explore proportionate handling. What actually is it? Proportionate care is essentially the concept of ensuring that the right level of resources are allocated to the care task. It's also been known as single-handed care within movement and handling, but the phrase seems to have changed, certainly within a training perspective, from single-handed care training to proportionate handling, because single-handed can sometimes provide the impression that the training or the techniques are just about getting a care package to be managed with one person. Well, that's not actually always the case. It could be that there are 3 carers supporting somebody, and actually it could be reduced to 2 with the right techniques or with the right equipment. So saying single-handed care can sometimes just provide a bit of a misconception. Interestingly, though, as we go through this webinar, I am going to start referring to single-handed care in a number of scenarios, because that can have some of the implications we're going to talk about environmentally are based on our understanding of single-handed care and the impact that can have on other things. So I'll interchange proportionate handling and single-handed as we go through, but for specific reasons. It's a strategy used to maximize dignity and build increased capacity into the care system without compromising safety. And it should never be solely about saving money or time. I deliver single-handed care training. The OT service delivers single-handed care training in collaboration with A1 Risk Solutions. And often when we're delivering that kind of training, as a starting point, we say, what are your expectations of this? Why do you think you're here? And understandably, a lot of people as a starting point say, well, the trust or the organization are wanting to save money by reducing care. And it's how we start to dispel some of that. Proportionate or single-handed care is not necessarily about the immediate saving of money, because things take longer to do as with one person. So it isn't even about cutting time in lots of cases. It's about being able to put resources back into the system from a corporate perspective. But we're going to touch on dignity a lot more through this webinar, and what dignity means, and how single-handed care or proportionate handling can support that. Why is it important? Just a few facts to start with. So as of August 2022, there were reported 542,000 individuals awaiting assessment or review in the community alone. That's a huge amount of people who are just in the system waiting for assessment from a healthcare professional. Now, we do lots of work in this sector, supporting local authorities with things like waiting lists or training, and I wouldn't be surprised if that figure is actually significantly higher. This is just what's been reported. There's also nothing in there that says how long have those people been waiting for. Between August and October 2021, there were 1.5 million care hours not being able to be provided in England. So who was filling those gaps? Family, friends, informal carers, or the person who needed the care was just going on and continuing to struggle. So again, it's us starting to consider how proportionate handling or proportionate care can build in capacity back into that community resource. This is an interesting statistic because it doesn't immediately look like it could be affected by proportionate handling, but let me explain. So in December 2022, there were a total of 75 incidents of A&E diverts. So A&E diverts are where an A&E department effectively closes, says we're full, we're at capacity, there's nowhere for people to go, you're going to have to go somewhere else, you're going to have to go to a different hospital. That's an A&E divert. So in that 1 month alone, that happens 75 times. So why is that fact included as part of a proportionate handling webinar? Well, one of the issues there is patient flow. So a hospital gets full because people aren't leaving hospital, not just because people are arriving. And one of the major factors in people not being able to leave hospital on time is community resource and carers and being able to implement care packages effectively. So the theory there is if we're building in more resource into the community for people's care needs to be able to be met, and that flow through hospital becomes more efficient. And in the same month, there was a daily average of 1,772 waits in an ambulance at a hospital of 30 to 60 minutes and 1,970 waits in an ambulance outside a hospital for more than an hour. So we're only talking December last year. It's a huge sum. And the final one, dignity. This is a theme through this webinar, so you have to bear with me with it. Dignity plays a huge role in the training that we deliver around single-handed care or proportionate handling. And that's it. We're going to discuss how that is implemented in more detail moving forward. But the basic premise is the less people who are there supporting someone with personal care, the more dignified it is for the person. So let's just, for a moment, consider dignity in using the toilet. Now, clearly, this is a rhetorical question. But before we move to the next slide, just ask yourself, or just think, have I used the toilet today? And depending on what time you're watching this webinar, how many times have I used the toilet today? So let's consider the averages then. So for most people, the normal number of times to urinate per day is between 4 and 8 in one 24-hour period. And the Scandinavian Journal of Gastroenterology, in their study, said that 98% of its participants opened their bowels between 3 times per week to 3 times per day. Now that's a huge scope, that's a huge variation. But if you consider, just for yourself personally, reflect on what's your average? How does that work for you? And then consider how you would feel if you could only go to the toilet 4 times a day. So those statistics that we just heard before, and I've used 4 times a day based on the standard large care package, somebody coming in to help someone get to the toilet or to do other things, meals, personal care, general personal care, 4 times per day. So if your toileting routines were restricted, normal toileting routines, by that I mean going to the toilet, not using a pad or a commode or a bedpan, if you were told you could only go 4 times a day, how would you feel if you couldn't use the toilet even as part of that? So if you were having to use the bedpan, if you were having to use the commode at your bedside because you couldn't get to the toilet, and how would you feel if you had to ask for help to wash and dry yourself after using the toilet? So this is part of the reflection on dignity within this webinar. And we come back to it later after we've considered the potential adaptations or the potential resources we could use to alleviate some of this lack of dignity or some of these challenges. But just keep that in the back of your mind for now. how is proportionate handling achieved in moving and handling? So there has to be cultural buy-in. So by that, I mean, it can't be a singular team who says, we're going to adopt a proportionate handling or single-handed care approach. There are authorities who've done that or tried that, and it might have very short-term gains. But consider the scenario then where you go to a person's home, they don't have a current care package, or they have a care package of 2 or more people for hoisting, and you say, yes, this can be done with 1 person. You then go to the care agency and you write an incredibly robust move and handle plan, risk assessment, and say, yes, this can be with 1 person. And the care agency say, absolutely no chance. We don't use hoists with 1 person. It can't be done. There has to be the buy-in between social care, the resources social care use to implement that, and health. Health play a huge role in this. Because if a social care team are fantastic at it, working within a council, even if the care agencies have bought in, they've completed the training, they're absolutely fantastic at it. But people are being discharged from a hospital with a care package recommendation of 2 carers to use a hoist, or for specific certain techniques, or even something as simple as standing up out of the chair, or to use a walking aid with. They then go home with that, altering that after it's been installed is far more challenging than it being dealt with at the time of recommendation, because it then becomes an expectation from the client, the person, the family, everybody involved in that is, well, why are you reducing it? It's a reduction in care. My parents' needs haven't changed. Why is that being changed? So it's really important that across the health, social care, and care sectors, there is complete cultural buy-in, and it's why it works best if everybody is trained, everybody has the same training, from ward-based staff to OTs and physios working in the community, or anybody who'd be recommending or reviewing care packages, and the care agencies themselves. That's where organisations have the best long-term results. Access to key equipment is really important. When we're delivering this kind of training, we will discuss what that kind of set pack is. So profiling beds, gantry systems as a short-term solution, pre-sealing track, the right kinds of slide sheets, wedges to support someone on their side if that's what they need. These sorts of things, and the right slings, these sorts of things are basic pieces of equipment that every equipment store or whoever provides your equipment would need to have in stock, and you would need to be able to access quickly without needing specialist approval in order to implement that kind of care quickly. Knowledge and skill seems pretty straightforward, but everybody needs to buy into the training for that. Everybody needs to know how to solve the problems. Everyone needs to know the key fundamental principles around proportionate handling and how it is made safe for everyone. And collaboration, I think, just encapsulates all of those. So collaboration across ICBs, across budget holders, across therapists, therapist team leads, care providers, their supervisors, anybody who is involved, any stakeholder involved in that whole process has to be collaborated with in order to make this work. So a lot of the training that people do rightly focuses on the moving and handling techniques. And as an OT, when I'm there delivering that training, or when I've had it delivered to me, or clinically when I have someone in my caseload I'm doing this with, I'm always then thinking, okay, what's the impact on occupation? What's the impact on function? It's great to be able to know how to do it from a technique perspective, but actually, what are the functional implications of proportionate handling? What does it mean in terms of the activities? The first one, and I've intentionally put this first, is that the first implication is there are increased time for the carer to complete the tasks. So that's why I said at the very beginning, this is not about saving time or reducing how much money is spent on care, if it's done right. So if you consider 2 carers currently supporting somebody with a hoisting transfer, a lot of the time, so in our experience, around about 60 to 70% of the time, as a conservative estimate, that can be done with one person. With the right training, with the right equipment, one person can manage that activity. But they can't do it in the same period of time that 2 were doing it, clearly, because they're doing more of the elements. So none of this is about reducing time. The person themselves will likely have more time, the carer, because it takes them maybe half that time again. What was a half-hour task might take 45 minutes. So they have more time with that single carer, potentially making more dignified, building up personal relationships with that carer. But what it does for the system is allow the second carer to go and spend half an hour or 45 minutes with somebody else. That's the point. So this isn't about rushing through functional tasks. So how does that relate to tasks like getting dressed, getting washed, using the toilet, cleaning someone after they've used the toilet? As part of the training, we go through some techniques of how to get somebody dressed on the bed with one person using glide sheets or using slide mitts, for example, and how to put pads in place with one person. But again, we're talking about, as occupational therapists, the meaningful occupations. So what does the person want to be able to do, and how does single-handed care, proportionate handling, how does it impact on those tasks? So task analysis is key to that. So it's important that we understand the requirements of each task, and therefore activity analysis. So this should for occupational therapists be straightforward. We should know what we're doing here. But within single-handed care, what I mean is it's paying attention to how does the activity analysis impact on the handling and therefore the functional tasks. What within the activities is the person able to do for themselves? How aware of it are they? What risks is that developing or providing? Is the person able to manage controls of things themselves? Are they able to lift themselves up in the hoist if they want to, using the controls? Do they have the motor skills to be able to do that? What is their flexion like at their knees, for example, that support the ability to roll? And if they can't do that, there are techniques that make that just as easy by using sling and hoist, say, for example, that we teach in training packages. But it's going through that robust activity analysis to understand first, if we think about that kind of PEO element, what is the person able to do and what do they need? What are the routines of tasks? So that isn't just about what routines have been enforced, but what does the person want to do at certain times? When do they want to engage? And what activities are they wanting to engage in? And when in the day? If we consider some of the things we're talking about single-handed care-wise, it doesn't just mean that carers are going to be available on tap just to pop in whenever they can. It's still going to be around that structured care package. But if we're able to promote single-handed care, for example, then it empowers informal carers to be able to support the person in those gaps, just to provide more dignity, but also to provide more flexibility within that person's routines. So understanding what the routines currently are, how they currently happen, and what the person would like to happen could be two completely different things. But it's really important as part of the task analysis to understand those things. And as occupational therapists, clearly we should be considering the meaningful occupations, meaningful engagement. Just because the person's being hoisted, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be goal setting. It doesn't mean that writing of a moving and handling plan shouldn't be occupation focused. We're going to write a moving and handling plan very differently to a care supervisor, very differently to a physio might write it. There'll be elements of that risk assessment that are the same or similar, but our focuses should just be slightly different. We have different training. So our recording of what the person deems meaningful to them is very important. And then how we're using proportionate handling or single-handed care to facilitate that engagement in meaningful occupation. And there again, so goal setting. What does the person want to achieve as part of those tasks? Are they happy having a pad put on them in the bed by the one person, or actually would they much prefer to be able to get to the toilet and not have to be washed after moving their bowels in a pad or on a bedpan? If they are absolutely fine with that and they're happy with that and that's what they want to achieve and it's for different reasons, maybe moving is too painful, absolutely no issue with that at all. But unless we ask the questions, how can we explore it? Because there are solutions to those things. Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with TILE, and I just mentioned it there before, the TILE risk assessment. Now, we could talk a lot about TILE itself and how the language within TILE treats somebody as an inanimate object, but it does its job. We understand that the person we're assessing and the person we're writing the handling plan for isn't a load, as it says entirely, or the person. But as long as our language that we're using within that reflects that, then okay. What we're focusing on here, and why I've put the caption on this slide, is we're focusing on the environmental elements. And the reason I'm doing this is because on reflection of my own work in the past, is that a lot of the things I've considered within TILE for environment are very much around the questions you can see on there. Is the environmental space safe for moving and handling? Is the space restricted? Are there any problems with lighting? Are there any problems with temperature or ventilation? Any problems with floor surfaces? Any slips, trips, falls hazards? Is it noisy? What I'm thinking about there is there anything, because this is the risk assessment, am I thinking, is the environment causing any risk? And if it is, what do I do about it? So changing of carpets, removal of rugs, more ventilation, those sorts of things. What I'm not necessarily thinking about here is how can I adapt the environment to support or to improve the actual handling or resource being used. It's not necessarily leaning me down the route of, well, what could I change about the environment to support single-handed or proportionate handling care? It's making the assumption that I've already decided is needed, and thinking, what risks am I identifying with the environment to support or negate that? So what we're going to have a look at next is, what are the options, or what do I need to be considering environmentally to help facilitate or support single-handed care? So how does the move towards a single-handed care approach impact on design and adaptations? So this is really useful at the time of assessment, but it's also really useful if you're involved first and foremost from a DFG perspective. So if you've been asked to go and make recommendations about certain adaptations, like level access shower, wet room, ceiling track hoisting, it's that process of, I think, changing the starting point when it comes to moving and handling, and considering one person being the starting point and then working forwards the other way. So rather than working back from, well, they've got two people, can it be one? It's that starting point. Particularly, obviously, this is for new care packages. The starting point is it's one person, and then think moving forwards to, is there a reason it needs to be two? And it seems quite straightforward, that, but it's a completely different mindset, and therefore I think has different implications on design. So how do we move towards single-handed care approach and impact on design adaptations? So hoisting, there is absolutely no doubt that the long-term best practice solution for single-handed care is ceiling track. Now, we can recommend gantry systems in the short term, and we teach techniques how to do this with a mobile hoist. So there's no reason from a safety perspective, actually, that a lot of these standard techniques can't be done with a mobile hoist. They absolutely can. Don't please ever get drawn into a mobile hoist has to be used with two people. It doesn't. There's nothing in legislation that says that it has to be with two people. And often one of the things that we challenge is when care agencies or other organizations have policies that say it must be with two people. But for the first reason being, they're actually getting themselves into a bit of a hole there, because what happens if it needs to be 3 or 4 or 5? If they're saying it must be 2, then what we assume they mean is no less than 2. But often policies don't say that, they say with 2. So that's the first point for them. All the HSE say is, and any other governing body or guidance group say, is that it's based on individual risk assessment. And there is absolutely nothing to say that mobile hoists can't be used with one person to manage these techniques. Now, clearly, I am not saying that is the best long-term solution. It isn't. But if there is an emergency situation, or you're having to wait a couple of days or a few days to get a gantry system in, and it means that the person is going to be in bed for that time, and that makes them vulnerable, or there are issues with turning the person onto their side to manage their personal care, the techniques can be used that we teach with a mobile hoist. But the seal and track system is the best long-term solution. So within single-handed care, the difference I think that can make, and some of these things aren't restricted just to single-handed care, but it's just that you might be thinking about them from a slightly different angle, is which rooms is the person going to be accessing and why, and how many people is it going to be, are they going to be supporting them with it? So for example, it might be that you're looking at seal and track systems that have a length to support the transfer out of bed. It might be that there is a system in the bathroom to support the person into the shower or bath or over the toilet. It might be that there's a system in a living space, for example, to get the person to a comfy chair or wherever they want to be. Clearly, many other potential solutions. I'm just giving those as examples. Within single-handed care, it might just be that you're considering the automated tracking. So you're thinking about the actual support that's being provided so that the carer doesn't have to physically move the person along the track. Does that free up a hand just to maintain stability in that system, rather than having two hands on and moving across the system like would be used in the gantry system? But it's just as part of your plan, having that in your mind of this is going to be one person doing it. So actually, from a if you something like a Borg scale perspective. So if you don't know Borg, that is the scale that you can use to analyze the task in terms of effort. It could be that using an electronic system reduces that Borg score, which means you can identify, you can evidence that as being a task that's sustainable for a longer period of time. Less people, less space. And is that actually the case? So just because there's less people, the person is going to be moving from one side to the other potentially. Now, maybe not from the bed technique perspective. Gold standard might be, yes, you have access to both sides of the bed, but in a domestic environment, just because a bed's up against a wall and there's nowhere else for it to go, doesn't mean that you're limited with single-handed care. There are a number of techniques that allow you to do that completely safely and from one side of the bed, using bed sheet systems, and how you use slings and seal and track and gantry hoist. So it's having that thought of just because there's less people, does that mean you need less space? In some environments, that might be the case. In some environments, like the bathroom, say, for example, you might be, let's think, less concerned about the minimum standard of 450 mils from the center of the pan to the wall, because you know the way you're developing that plan, you're not going to have someone on either side of the toilet. Well, what if somebody isn't going to fit into that 450 mil gap? But if they're not going to be there, does that matter? And if you're managing the techniques for toileting in that way or for hoisting in that way, it's in what way are they approaching the toilet? And how do you, from a task analysis perspective, how do you design that activity with the person and their carer to enable access to one side only? And then does that impact on where the track is going to be and what the length of that track is? So I'm just trying to give some reflections on how single-handed care in particular can just have different thought processes. Even if the outcome is the same, the clinical reasoning could be slightly different to get there, and it's really important that we clearly and robustly document the clinical reason behind what we're saying. The equipment required, so this is particularly related to the impact on the environment. What are you storing? There are a number, like I've said, there are a number of bits of key equipment there that we've talked about. Where are they in the house, and what is the impact on the space that's being used? And access to the person I've kind of touched on already around the space around the bed, the toilet, for example. And thinking, do I understand techniques enough? Is my training robust? Do I know that actually I only need access to one side of the bed, so I don't need to move all of these other things out? Even though access to both sides might be your ideal. So the design considerations, therefore, are the seal and track solutions. Again, just reflecting on not a standard template. If your recommendation is that it can be managed with single-handed care, how does that impact on the layout? DocM design, is the minimum standard enough? I've referenced that minimum standard of the 450 mils from the center of the pan to the wall as a starting point. But I mean, for anybody, is it enough? We could argue that it maybe isn't, but it's understanding, like I say, from a task analysis perspective, where is the carer going to be? Where are they going to stand? Where are they going to walk and move? And how do I then design the layout on that basis. Carer screens, what's needed to support that one person. That might be no different to whether the care package is one carer or two or three, because you're unlikely to have 2 or 3 carers in the shower. I've put it in there though, just as a potential. If the person is going from a larger care package where they are helping the person in the shower, and you're going down to one, does that change that part of the environment? Don't forget the task takes longer. So things like ventilation or exposure to temperatures or steam in a bathroom when the person's being showered, they are likely to be in those spaces for longer. So consider how that impacts on other elements of your design and whether you need to remove some of those risks or hazards to support the person's comfort. And what are the toileting solutions? So to reduce handling and to maximize dignity. So how do you get, once the person's at the toilet, how do you maximize the dignity to negate the need to then move the person somewhere else to clean them, for example? Excuse me. It's one thing to get the person to the toilet from the bed so that they don't need to use the bedpan or to use the commode. But then if you're having to take them back to the bed or to a shower chair to then clean them after using the toilet, then kind of are you defeating the purpose? So again, for toileting, the task analysis is really important. Is it dignified? Is cleaning currently be completed elsewhere? So are you moving the person somewhere else? How many people is it taking? Are there alternative solutions? And how could adapting the environment impact on the task? So rather than just getting the person to the toilet, getting them to a wash-dry toilet to then mean the task is completely potentially independent for the person while they're there. You might not need to be in the room. They're not needing to be taken somewhere else to be cleaned. Could be far more dignified. And that's outside of your kind of standard DocM design. So it's just thinking, what's the purpose of them going to the toilet? And once they're there, how do I make that the most dignified process that we possibly can? So just a brief reflective conclusion. Lots of the things that I've talked about there might not be limited to just single-handed care or proportionate handling. There could be thought processes for every bit of work that you do. However, there are differences when it comes to single-handed care. So it's having that at the forefront of your mind and thinking, how does what I'm recommending from a design perspective support or hinder the single-handed care? Can I take design to the next stage to make sure that these tasks have longevity, that they can be managed for a long period of time, and that they can maximize dignity? And as the graphic there shows on that slide, this isn't just about somebody who's using a hoist. It could be somebody who's using a standing aid who maybe doesn't need one if the right equipment, other equipment's in place. Or it could be that they're needing assistance of one, and actually if the right equipment's in place over the toilet, for example, they don't need any support with that at all. And that's where the proportionate bit comes in. So don't just think about single-handed care, think proportionately. Does the person need care at all with the right equipment in place? And if they do, is it proportionate? Is it dignified? Thank you. Now a word from Closomat.